Since my first completion of Sekiro, it has felt like the most personal game in From Software's discography, where it never amassed the same scale of appeal that the Souls trilogy or Bloodborne did in the West, or that Elden Ring has over what seems like the rest of the world. Something tells me that Sekiro, out of all these games, holds a special place in the hearts of the developers. On a mechanical level, Sekiro's tight and focused combat system allows the patented From Software difficulty to reach what is probably its peak while retaining the most balanced gameplay of all products on offer. On a thematic level, it has the most striking and vivid imagery of Japanese culture I have experienced in any game, from the architecture, flora and fauna, mythological connections, and religious and spiritual parallels. From a Japanese studio, it's hard not to imagine this is the pinnacle of their combined game design and cultural heritage. So, before I talk about the ways I would alter a Japanese game studio's sacred product, I want to say with no uncertainty that Sekiro is a phenomenal experience. Yet also since my first playthrough, I have always had a recurring thought that my enjoyment and connectivity to the game was being artificially inhibited, mostly by the Spirit Emblem system. Let me ask you what throwing a shuriken, swinging an axe, using a flamethrower, opening an umbrella, thrusting a spear, swinging a smaller sword, lighting a firecracker, and whistling have in common. They are not spiritual activities. I've done most of these, and it didn't cost me any spiritual power. There seems to have been a lot of discourse over this mechanic, and maybe I was unfortunate enough to end up on this side of it, but I feel like there was a way we could have gotten the best of both worlds here. It makes sense to have a cost factor for using a few of the prosthetic tools, and for the Mist Raven and Divine Abduction, Spirit Emblems could absolutely be justified as that ammunition. What has frustrated me about some of the tools is that the resources already exist in the game. Scrap iron could be turned into shurikens, oil could power the flame vent, and gunpowder could spark the firecrackers. As for the other tools, I think the fun factor of using them uncapped far outweighs the game factor of managing their resources effectively. I mean, to be blunt, it's an axe, let me swing it. It's a spear, let me thrust it. It's a sword, let me swing that too. It's an umbrella, let me open it. It's a whistle, let me whistle it. I can see how certain upgrades can incur or increase a cost, and I even think I would be fine with a cost for all Lazulite variants, just because they're the most powerful. But overall, I don't see the purpose other than to hold the player back. The community consensus is that Sekiro is the most difficult of the modern era From Software games, and on most days I think I would agree. I'm sure we all remember the infamous article that spawned the "you cheated not only the game, but yourself" quote. I can't help but imagine that is not exclusively the strict combat patterns that filter out players, but the restrictions imposed by the Spirit Emblems. Through this imposition, I would imagine a significant portion of players always felt as if they were significantly weaker than they should be. Because the game is always supplying the player with tools, it's also continuing to reinforce them that they should be much more competent than they may feel that they are. Suppose a player was feeling this lack of control and decided to experiment. They are inadvertently setting themselves up to a forced grind. Since the bosses in Sekiro are very unrelenting, it could take quite a few attempts, not to mention Spirit Emblems, to find an appropriate combination of tool and opening for any particular boss. The standout combinations are also few and far between. I think the most well-known is using the loaded spear to yank out the Guardian Ape Centipede, or using the Malcontent Ring on the Demon of Hatred. Unless you consider knocking Lady Butterfly out of the air to be significant, that's really about it for interesting applications against the bosses. While it's great that most of the others are reliable to use and have reliable effects, the steep challenge of defeating almost all enemies, let alone bosses, will result in death after death. While a player drains their emblem reserves every run, The repeated deaths drain the player's sin, which means they can purchase less emblems for repeat attempts. The fact that you can purchase emblems at first seems like it removes most of the issues that arise from the system, but it only frustrates me more. Spirit emblems are not the only thing players may want to spend their sin on, since several prosthetics, their upgrades, gourd seeds, and combat techniques are sold at high prices. The best advice for new players is to dump any excess sin into emblems, but a new player is the most likely to experiment with the tools the game gives them, and they are the most likely to eat up stored emblems. And if a first-time player opted not to dump all their leftover sin into emblems early on, they will find themselves suffering inflation as the price tag rises significantly as the game progresses. There is also a common thought that if you dump any leftover sin into emblems, the mechanic is effectively circumvented. While this is generally true and will result in having a surplus, if the only solution is to basically remove the mechanic, there's not a good reason to keep the mechanic. Another issue is that emblems are further arbitrated by limiting the amount you can hold at any given time. Even with a maxed out capacity, you can burn through emblems surprisingly fast if you want to make use out of the tools you have expressed the skill to earn and the time and money to upgrade. This limit might be okay if it was only limited to valid spiritual costs, but the idea that you can't unleash a slash of dark energy with mortal draw because you threw too many shurikens is just silly. Bloodborne mitigated this issue by allowing the player to add bullets to their reserves at the cost of health from the start of the game, and an unlimited number of times at that. But one of Bloodborne's longest standing criticisms is still players find themselves needing to grind for bullets and particularly blood vials. Sekiro offers the player a similar tool with the ceremonial Tanto, which again would be great if emblems were only used for legitimately spiritually powered actions, but as it stands, it's just another band-aid on a self-inflicted wound. Another frankly disempowering restraint is the spirit emblem cost on combat arts. A highly versatile and cool-looking move is the exact reward a player should receive for dedicating the resources to acquire them. Not all combat arts have a cost, but some that do have it for no real reason. I don't mind the combat arts that have legitimate spiritual power like Mortal Draw, Dragon Flash, or even One Mind having a cost to use effectively, but the last thing I want to worry about as a player is managing a resource for the cool sword move I had to grind for a lot longer than I really wanted to even have the chance to use it. A lot of players wish they could cycle through at least 3 different combat arts like prosthetics, and I think this would be a really great addition to the systems and introduce a lot of fluidity. That being said, I don't think it necessarily holds players back the same way emblems do with their prosthetics. And on the subject of the XP system, it has too much bogging it down to feel like a rewarding mechanic. The meter builds exponentially slower the more that you earn, and that makes sense from a role-playing perspective. But Sekiro is not a role-playing game. This feels like Souls DNA getting mixed into the pot when it doesn't really need to be. And even in those games, your experience is tied to the amount of souls you carry, which can be boosted with ring slots and runes and can be acquired at a much faster speed. If there is a Mibu balloon of XP, that might have gone a long way to speed up this really slow process, but for reasons beyond my comprehension, From Software decided to add every other type of balloon except XP. There may be some players out there who maxed out the majority of the skill trees without grinding, but I'm gonna bet the vast majority of them found themselves resetting the Ashina Castle and outskirts countless times. Just like prosthetic costs, this solution is already kind of present. Just have combat text available to be found or rewarded after defeating certain enemies and mini-bosses. This would go a long way to prevent any buyer's remorse when you realize that the Shadow Rush you spent maybe an hour pumping XP into has an emblem cost, and it's a lot more expensive than it's really worth using. Another mechanic that serves basically no purpose is Dragon Rot. not only is Dragonrot poorly explained, but its implementation carries basically no weight for the entire game. I'm also willing to bet that over half the players opted not to resurrect additional times under the presumption that doing so would inflict an NPC with Dragonrot, and I know for a fact all of us rolled our eyes when those NPCs got sick anyway. If Dragonrot actually carried any consequence, then I can see this common occurrence causing several players to shut off the game. I guess it's lucky then that Dragonrot has no significant impact. The worst that will happen is an NPC questline gets placed on hold. But most NPCs don't even have a questline, and the few that do carry just as little impact as the disease itself. And actually, since one of From Software's trademarks of game design is carefully worded in place dialogue, you could argue that a player should go out of their way to inflict Dragonrot on as many NPCs as possible to hear the lore significance of their pained wheezes. You cure Dragonrot for everyone at the same time when you use a Dragon's Blood droplet, so yeah, players are in a way incentivized to prolong curing characters until there are enough infected to make it worth it. Not that there is any shortage of droplets, and they're not even expensive either. It's more beneficial to the player to restore their unseen aid than to cure characters. Speaking of unseen aid, it also feels very half-baked. The only time it seems to proc for most players is after enough deaths to bosses that their XP and Sin have long been depleted. The chance that it occurs when you would actually like it to are too slim to really consider, and when it does kick in after you have nothing worth saving, it feels almost comical. Maybe if the chance rose alongside the amount of enemies you defeat in a single life, or if you could donate a portion of your Sin or Spirit emblems to secure it, it would feel like it belonged a lot more, but as it stands, it's just another pathetic bone tossed so lazily at the player, it has me wondering what the point of it even is. I guess if it gets triggered during an intense XP grinding session, that might save you a gray hair or two, but I don't know any good reason grinding needs to exist in this game in the first place. Speaking of grinding, let's address the Sculptor's Idols. The bonfire mechanic of resurrecting the player and enemies has become synonymous with From Software game design, and for good reason. It's a solid mechanic. And while there's something to be said of the intense Buddhist influence over Sekiro, I don't see how it links thematically with the game overall. If I cared less about video games and more about religious histories, I could probably convey this a little more cogently. But from what little I know on the subject, Buddhism is more focused on reincarnation than strict resurrection. It has been a while since any other video essayist talked about ludonarrative dissonance, so maybe I can get away with it here. In Dark Souls, since you and basically everything else are undead, the mechanic fits thematically. And in Bloodborne, since the entire story is cloaked in Lovecraftian nightmare pseudo-logic, the mechanic fits thematically, so why exactly does Sekiro need the bonfire mechanic? It might be asking for a totally different game, but I think I would prefer it if the level design made all of the encounters more interesting by offering a stricter challenge and keeping slain enemies dead, or at least dead for a prolonged amount of time. The most interesting location in Sekiro for me is Ashina Castle, because you return to it again and again and find that new enemies keep invading, and as such, new challenges are placed for the player to overcome. If this happened across more areas and with the right frequency, it would go a long way to both add distance from a mechanic that I don't think really fits, and tie in with the overarching plot point of the invasion of the Interior Ministry. I think instead of enemies respawning, the game would work a little better with a more level-by-level design. The game has patched in remembrances to fill in for a boss rush mode, and so I don't think it would be too much to also ask for area-specific remembrances that load different enemy placements across these different, theoretically changing battle arenas. Sculptor's idols are already far too prevalent and placed too close together, and despite having a grappling hook, there's a real lack of traversal across different environments. Sekiro was the closest we ever got back to the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1, and with the inclusion of a grappling hook, I don't think there needed to be any warping fast travel across the idols either. This might be the wildest take here, but I think some inspiration from the Fable series might slot into the idea of death and the blood of the divine heir. In Fable, when the player falls to 0 HP, instead of resetting a level or loading a checkpoint, the player character gets knocked out for about 3 seconds and wakes back up, with a new scar somewhere on the player model. It might sound stupid to think this fits in Sekiro, but with the understanding this game has on themes of undeath and how Dragonrot spreads, I think thematically it's appropriate to simply not allow Sekiro to flat out die, but to continually revive himself. The punishment then would come from the unrewarding feeling of consistently dying and breaking flow state, and for each consecutive death, Dragonrot would afflict additional NPCs, ideally with some actual ramifications. So the bullet points are 1. Rework prosthetics so that only those with innate spiritual power or become later infused with that power cost spirit emblems, while retooling some items to function as ammo for others. 2. Rework combat arts in basically the same way. 3. Have all combat arts and skills be found in the world in the form of the esoteric texts or even available for purchase from different trainers. 4. Just gut the XP system. 5. Remove the bonfire resurrection mechanic and have slain enemies gradually be replaced with reinforcements of the invading interior ministry. 6. Allow area-specific remembrances to replay those original areas at the player's discretion. 7. Allow Sekiro to revive an unlimited number of times using this infinite revive to drive home the dangers of Dragonrot. 8. Add danger to Dragonrot. Kill the NPCs and add some weight to our poor gameplay. 9. Change unseen aid to be purchased with sin-like emblems akin to an offering, along with having it increase with enemies slain to ensure that Dragonrot does not spread too uncontrollably. If the revive mechanic is infinite, those resurrection nodes can be swapped with unseen aid nodes. 10. Remove around half the sculptor's idols, and place more emphasis on inter-area connectedness through traversal methods like the grappling hook and the hidden walls. The important thing I want to make clear is that most of the game is not getting totally overhauled or thrown out, with the exception of the XP system. The issues I have with this game are that it makes conscious choices to hold itself back, and with these tweaks, I think the game can remove all of that friction that's stuck in the wrong places, and place more friction in the places that matter the most, where the rubber meets the road. I also think that it would go a long way to say how Sekiro has core gameplay so satisfying that even with so many of these awkward restrictions, it's still a game well worth playing. Unlike the other offerings in From Software's catalog, Sekiro can bestow a sense of mastery that the more RPG-centric Soulsborne, Ring, whatever games can offer. I will keep returning to Sekiro for years to come, but the game as it is puts the flawed in Flawed Masterpiece with more authority than any other game I've ever played.
参りましょう。西に神なる竜の